wanted to try for a while to make some woven cattail baskets, but I've never done this before. So the first thing I did is I looked up how to harvest cattails sustainably. Looks like there are a couple of rules for this. One is to harvest at the right time, which is after the seed heads have finished forming and are starting to disperse, which is approximately in mid-September where I am. Another is not to harvest the whole clump, and also to be aware of the animals that might be living in the cattails. I've been reading Robin Kimmerer's book Braided Sweetgrass recently, which is kind of what inspired me to actually go for the cattails. She talks a lot about cattails in this book because they were so heavily used by Native Americans, and some people are actually calling them the supermarket of the swamp because literally every part of them has a use. I did know already that you could eat the rhizomes, which apparently also filter the water. They've effectively filtered things like arsenic and lead out of water, so this is a reason why I don't necessarily want to eat them here in the city where I am right now. She also talks about how the pollen has a lot of protein, and you can add it to things like flour. There's also such a thing as Cossacks asparagus, which I think is made from the young shoots. I can't tell you firsthand which parts of it taste like cucumber, but apparently some do. And of course the leaves have a multitude of uses, making baskets like I'd like to try. And she also talks about how they were making wigwam walls out of them because they're waterproof, and when it's cold and wet, the leaves expand slightly and seal up all of the cracks. And when it's warm and dry, when you want air to come through, they shrink back down and let the air through. Apparently in the spring there's also a gel that comes out of the leaves that functions a lot like aloe vera and has analgesic and antiseptic properties. The other thing that I think is really worth mentioning from this book is a concept called the honorable harvest. Basically, the honorable harvest is a set of indigenous principles that they used when they were harvesting stuff. And because it's a tradition that's been passed down over the years, it's never been officially written down as a set of rules. But Robin Kimmerer does explain it in her book. And it's ideas like, don't take the first plant you see, don't take the last plant you see, use everything you take and only take as much as you need. I was thinking a lot about the honorable harvest as I was doing this because I have no idea what I'm doing, so I have no idea how to actually honorably harvest cattails. The thing is, I'm taking so little right now, and I took it from a bunch of different spots that I don't think it's a problem. I just think that this concept is really important for a society as a whole to take notice of, because we pretty much have nothing but dishonorable harvest. Part of the reason that I'm doing all of this craft foraging stuff is because I think it's really important to know where your stuff comes from. Because if you do, then you're more likely to use it in a way that makes it last longer. You also realize what your actual environmental toll is, and not just something bought from a store. Time to go home. I'm supposed to dry these now. Normally people do this by putting them on screens outdoors, but I don't have outdoors and I don't really have real estate either. So I think I'm gonna try and hang them on the wall. You're also supposed to cut off the brown tips and the bottoms. Actually, this might work. I know I'm going to look at this video after and go, why did you put it there? It's so crooked. Oh no! Aren't these supposed to hold like way more weight than what this is? Shit. Okay. These have to dry first because the first time they dry they shrink. So any basket that I wove for them now would kind of just fall apart. That can probably take anywhere from a couple days to a couple weeks. In the meantime, they can decorate my wall and I'm probably going to be sad to take them down because they look pretty nice. These have now been hanging on my wall for 3 weeks-ish. I didn't really count, but they're definitely very dry. They all kind of dried in different directions and some of them are like super sticking out from the wall, which is kind of interesting. I'm really curious to see what's going to happen to them when I rehydrate them, because right now they're kind of brittle and crunchy and I could never weave anything with them because they're not flexible enough. But supposedly one is supposed to either let them soak in water or wrap them in a wet towel and leave them to mellow. which I assume just means soak up water so they become more flexible. I've been doing some research on the internet about basket weaving with cattails, and there's actually a large dearth of information. There's a couple like survival skills, make a primitive cattail basket sort of things, which is, side note, an interesting idea, because just because something is made traditionally or was made hundreds of years ago, it doesn't mean that it's primitive by any means. Anyway, I didn't really find so much about the tradition of weaving cattail baskets. I did, however, find a series of videos about cedar basket twining. And I also found a video of an old Romanian woman twining baskets in a similar way with cattails. So I'm putting two and two together and using these two things as my guideline of how I'm going to make this basket. These have been in here for about 5 or 6 hours now. They're definitely softening up a lot, but I think some of them are still quite crunchy. But my theory is that I can use the ones that are not so crunchy anymore to start the basket, and then I can use the other ones as I move along. It's interesting because some of these cattails are super like squishy, and some of them are actually quite flat and don't have so much squish to them. You can see in here that this is like the squishy part. I'm going to use this thing as a mold, and I'm going to make the basket around this shape. I guess I want my basket to be that tall. 6, 7, 8. My goal is to make a square for the bottom, so I'm going to cut 8 more. Four, 5, 6, 7, 8. Perfect. I think it'll be useful to keep these soaking while I'm working on this. Okay. In this video that I've been watching with the cedar twined baskets, they do a double twining technique, which is also called a basic twining technique, to just hold the first side together.
You lift up a rope, you place the weaver behind it, and flat, making your X.
This person in the video has it turned around like this. This needs to be much closer to the middle. And let's say the middle is there. So I'm gonna move this down. And so let's see if I can't tighten it up. I don't know if I'm going to win with these because they're too floppy. So start twining.
It's perpendicular to each other. That's how you know that it's the next two that you take.
So this is called cutting the corners, because essentially I'm trying to turn it into an octagon, something that's not square anymore. So this is the stay stitching that I did before, and I'm going to take it out because now it's in the way. I'm definitely doing something funny in the corners, but I really have no idea what it is. So I've done now 3 rounds around the edge. The last one was with a 3-strand braid. I don't really feel like I did it right because the point of the 3-strand braid was to kind of give it a clean edge. And I feel like maybe I have a clean edge on the inside, but not so much on the outside. Apparently now the next thing to do is to fold the edges up, which shouldn't be too hard because they are cattails and not cedar bark. In the video that I'm watching, some people are biting down on it, but I'm gonna say that cattails are probably, oh, it did work. Nice. This is more square than I wanted it to be, but that's all right. Oh, look, it's sort of a basket. So clearly the easier way to work this is from the outside. Does that mean I should have bent it the other way? I realized, first of all, I think I should have been turning it this way. And also, they are splitting all of the warps in half. It's a little bit too big to fit over this thing. It's not snug by any means. I think this is because I wasn't able to put as much tension on this basket as I was seeing in the video because of the difference in material. So I'm just gonna keep doing this freehand. I'm quite a few rows in now, and I've identified all the problem spots. So the first problem is I don't know how to weave in ends, so I end up with stuff like this. But I have improved, so that's good news. The second thing is that I'm tapering inwards, which is no huge surprise to me because tension is kind of always the trickiest part of these sorts of things. So I've put it back on this thing I'm using as a mold, and I can see there's like quite a bit of space at the bottom, but now it's quite tight around the thermos. It's also tricky because my cattail pieces are all different sizes, so when I have a thinner weft, which is the part that's going across here, obviously it gets smaller because if I'm pulling the same amount, there's just not as much stuff taking up space. Here I'm taking the blunt side of my awl to kind of push stuff down because especially when I add a new piece, things tend to start to float up. I had to let this sit for a few days because I didn't have time, and in the meantime I let it dry out a little bit so that it wouldn't mold. But I've just rehydrated it with the towel and it seems to have gone back to pretty much normal. Now I'm going to learn how to twine the edge to finish it off.
So before you make your
I'm making this little hook out of a paper clip. Come here. And through. Now I'm just gonna go through and I'm gonna give all of these a tug so they sit very flush to the edge. This is finished, but now I'm supposed to let it dry because everything shrinks. And this I've already discovered because the bottom is a lot drier than it was when I first made it. And there's a lot of gaps in the bottom. So in the meantime, while I'm waiting for that thing to dry, I'm gonna start another one with what's called a twined bottom. Because this is a plaited bottom. A twined bottom is basically just what I was doing here on the outside. You just have to start from the middle and perpetually add warps. This is a great idea and I didn't do it before, but she's recommending that you tie a knot in one of your warps so that you know which one is the beginning of the round, because essentially it's going in a spiral, so it's the same thing as knitting and you want to know where your beginning is.
And you're wanting to really pull towards the center.
This really reminds me of my doily crocheting days. Except this is probably the stinkiest, slimiest doily I've ever made. My sad wet spider has slowly been turning into a bowl shape. This is clearly because I'm not adding warps fast enough. Well, it definitely resembles a basket. It's a really cool texture because it's like structured but still quite flexible, and I'm actually not afraid that it's going to crack. The plating really gives it a lot of room to move around. It actually feels very sturdy, surprisingly. I'm really having trouble keeping this damp enough to work with, especially because it's relatively large. So I'm gonna try putting a towel on it while I'm weaving. I'm starting to get actually quite annoyed with this thing. I'm just really not a fan of the materials. They're like slimy and smelly, but it's just really not my favorite thing to touch. It's a cool texture once it's dry, but working with it is like pretty much no fun. This is all also very difficult to manage, especially because it dries out very quickly. I was just watching the video of the Romanian lady who is doing this on YouTube, and she's using a basket mold, which is basically just like a wooden block that she has that she actually nails the bottom of the basket to so it can't move, and then she cinches the cattails around it, which I think in my case would help a lot because it would prevent it from tapering like I have trouble with now. She's also using a different twining stitch. Instead of passing every one cattail, she passes over every 2 cattails, and I think that also would be better for the size of cattails I'm using because it looks really uneven. I think just because they're bigger than the last basket that I tried. She does a completely different edging than the one that I saw in the video of the indigenous Alaskan people doing it. So I think I'm gonna actually tie this basket off now because my tolerance for the smell is starting to run very low.
I left this basket to dry overnight and it's starting to mold in the middle. I think because it's just been wet for so long. It's also because these tabs from when I added the warps are keeping it much more moist, and I was hoping not to cut them off until the end so that they would have fully dried, but I think that's a bad idea now because there's so much mold.
It was really interesting to do this because baskets are kind of a ubiquitous part of a lot of different cultures, but I think I've decided that cattails are not my material. I would be really interested to try with something else. This first one turned out quite nice actually, and I'm gonna keep it. But this one, I definitely got too ambitious, and I went too big. The bottom is kind of nice, but it did end up molding quite a bit. Part of the reason that I came here is to put this basket back in its natural environment. I kind of like the idea of reciprocity, that the cattails gave me something and then I give something back to the cattails. I like to think that some muskrat or something is going to find this basket and use it for its nest, or that some other person on the other side of the river is going to pick it up